Hello, and welcome to the CDO Magazine interview series. I'm Chris Knerr, Chief Digital Officer of Syniti, a world leader in enterprise data software, and we're partnering with CDO Magazine, MIT CDO IQ, and the International Society of Chief Data Officers to bring you this series of interviews with thought leaders in data and analytics. Today, I have the great pleasure of talking with Atif Usman, Global Data and Analytics Director, Zimmer Biomet. Welcome to the program. Terrific to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Chris.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Looking forward to our conversation. So maybe if we could get right into some of your background. You've done a lot of interesting roles, deep background in analytics and BI, but your current role spans data analytics and data science. Can you just give us a sense of, what's the brief of your current organization, and maybe a little bit about what's the data and data operations scope and accountabilities versus the analytics and data science side of the house?
Sure. So from the data and data operations side, we have a data engineering team that's kind of consolidating all our data from our various ERPs and other sources. And harmonizing that data and making sure it is validated per our business needs. Now on the data science side of the house, we kind of have a separate team dealing with that with a different focus, right? This is to ensure that our business requirements are met, and we are actually bringing value to the business. And really, we're trying to grow that space right now on the data science side. So it's not fully mature, but we are in the process of, maturity.
Okay, no, thanks. That's interesting. And I think it's, I like it when I see organizations that have both of those married together, because it's been an observation in a lot of my thought leader conversations that, not having good data and not having data operations in place is a barrier when you want to take things out of the lab and scale them. So I think it's interesting that you've started with that kind of foundational data capability, and then as you mentioned, growing the data science and analytics capability. So kind of building on that, let's talk a little bit about your strategy, and maybe you could share a bit about what role does your organization play in driving data provisioning for large programs, say UDI or another industry imperative, versus improvements to data operations versus business ROI imperatives, as you talked about. And maybe you can touch a little bit on that question of how you have curated data sets, decide what goes into the lab, and then decides what graduates out of the lab, while at the same time, if I've understood correctly, you're also doing data provisioning for large, complicated programs.
Right, absolutely. So in terms of strategy, we have our key imperatives on strategy, which, revolve around data literacy, because I feel like that's important out from the visualization perspective in the business. Having a strong consolidated and curated data set, as well as working with the business to build up our analytics maturity, both regular analytics and advanced analytics. How we kind of balance between large programs and smaller day-to-day kind of initiatives is the larger programs obviously have a dedicated, team that we assign to those. We have a lot of focus on that versus on the regular kind of day-to-day programs. We have, our team, or maybe our data architecture team and our visualization team kind of focus on those. Versus the larger programs are focused on by our data engineering team.
Yeah. Let me pick up on one comment you made, which I think is an interesting distinction. And intuitively, I think I know what you mean, but for the audience, you made a distinction between regular analytics and advanced analytics. Can you just build on that distinction a little bit and maybe talk about some of the different challenges in doing regular versus doing advanced?
Right. So regular analytics is just your normal KPIs in various business functions, right? That the business may need to either operate, their day-to-day function, or help streamline some of their processes, increase profitability, et cetera, right? Advanced analytics is where we bring in our, machine learning type models, trying to get to predictive analytics. And really the difference there is both of them, you need quality data, right? Because without the good data, your output will not be, usable. So with the advanced analytics, obviously there's more, I would say, trial and error there, right? You got to have a way to fail fast to know that, if the use case that you're working on will truly provide the value that is required versus the regular analytics. It's pretty well defined, that, this is what is needed for the business. There's a lot of tried and tested models and use cases out there, across industries.
So I had a very interesting conversation recently with a chief data officer who suggested that for advanced analytics and data science type work, we shouldn't think of the traditional IT funding model, which is basically like everything needs an ROI and it needs to be bulletproof or it never gets funded. That we should more think of things going into the laboratory the way we think about our product portfolio, and especially in a life sciences company, right? You make investments, there's a funnel. You assume from the outset that some of them are going to fail, but that the ones that succeed are going to have a disproportionately high ROI. When you're making your case in Zimmer Biomet for funding projects or funding OpEx for your organization, is that sort of funneling and bet approach, if you will, part of the dialogue as it relates to the advanced analytics work?
That's a good question. We haven't. That's definitely part of the conversation. We haven't fully materialized that kind of a model yet. The approach that we've taken is more of like a POC approach, right? Where we first do a POC on a use case, see how it pans out, if it will bring value, kind of almost like an innovation garage type of approach, right? Where you're trying to fail, like I mentioned earlier, fail fast as possible. And if you see value, you move forward into a project. If you don't see value, then you move on to the next thing.
Yeah, interesting. That conversation that I had recently just sort of spurred my thinking, and I think what you're describing is pretty common to sort of the innovation garage that a lot of companies do. But I was kind of taken by this idea that we could think of these analytics projects and POCs the same way that we think of products in sort of the early R&D funnel. That all ideas are good, and then the fail fast part is there. I think that, there's sort of a different maturity curve in different organizations as it relates to moving them through the pipeline. So coming back to the question of the, and I thought your answer was very clear on, how you deal with the large programs versus how you deal with innovation. How much complexity has merger and acquisition activity added in Zimmer and to your organization, just in terms of, even basic things like gluing together ERPs or, carving out divisions that you're divesting, and then, trying to drive any of the growth synergies or the cost synergies? Is that something that that your team gets engaged with?
Oh yeah, very heavily. So that's been a big challenge for the organization as well, because of the mergers and acquisitions that have happened in the past and continue to happen. We have a lot of ERPs, so we've had to consolidate data into our central data warehouse from different data sets, whether it's sales, financial, et cetera, whether it's for supply chain or compliance. And it's funny you speak of a spinoff. We're actually working on a spinoff right now. So yeah, there's complexity there as well in terms of how do you carve out data and isolate it or silo it off. Because before you're trying to end the silos, now we're trying to create a new silo, right? and to carve that out and do it while your operations continue, right? And then there has to be a cutoff date on, when the companies separate. And then there's obviously other regulatory requirements where what data that you still have to keep as part of, because you were part of, that company was a part of you at one point, and then what data they have to keep, as well. So some of that we're actually working on right now.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's a fascinating and very complicated area. And I've found over the years in talking to C-level executives, they often don't understand. It's like, well, it's a line of business. Why can't we just pick up that line of business and move it? But when you get down into the world you and I live in, you find that, you've got commingled bills of material, you've got commingled inventory, you've got vendors, that may have qualified raw materials and, market registrations and a lot of nuances that all have to be handled, in a very, very rigorous way in order even to define what the silo is that you're trying to put the carve out in. So very, very interesting area. Maybe I could, building on a point that you just made, and maybe to shift gears a bit, when in your shop and in your strategy, how are you dealing with external data? And maybe if you could just give, so in the life sciences and med device industry, in North America in particular, there's a data source called IMS, which is almost like the Bible of commercial operations in the life sciences world. So there are a lot of IMS subscriptions that, there are multiple other third-party subscriptions that are important in the industry. What my observation has been, they're very important, but they're often not very well integrated, so that it may be the case you'll have some data subscription and you'll go out looking and you'll find actually you have 3 of them or 6 of them, and they're being duplicated in different places. So talk a little bit about, one of the things that I sort of, my talk track to executives is what we've seen in the last 10 years is more data in more places, and a kind of porousness of the boundary that defines the enterprise as it relates to data versus third-party data. So maybe, share a few thoughts on that and how that's part of your strategy.
Sure. So a lot of that type of data, as we come across it, such specifically like IMS, that we've also brought into our data warehouse, and other third-party data sets that we continue to bring in, specifically around, when we're looking at these data science type and advanced analytics use cases, the external data becomes more critical because that's an influencing factor, especially in our, industry with surgeons and, how they would react to certain marketing campaigns or certain kind of product deployments and things like that. So those kind of things, those kind of data sets are very important to have on hand. And like you mentioned, we learn about data sets all the time, where we're talking to a business function, and they're like, well, we have this external data that we use from, XYZ company.
Yeah.
And, that's critical to our forecast or how we conduct our business processes. So we have to account for that and bring it in. What we do in the system, if you're kind of wondering from a system perspective, we try to segregate that, right? So this way we can reuse it, for other, use cases in the future.
What's it? So I guess two questions just to follow up on that. So one is, it sounds like, in what you were calling data literacy before, that, external data is probably lower maturity in terms of just people even understanding like, oh, I'm buying this data set. Like I should talk to my data and analytics team and understand, do we already have one? Do we already have 3? What's the best way to integrate it in? Like, is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I would say so. I think, as the data literacy amongst the organization matures, I think that's where you're going to have a more precise acquisition of meaningful data, external data, as well as a better understanding of how to leverage the internal data in conjunction with the external data, right? Because a lot of times what we're seeing is, people are just, they hear of something, they want to go grab buy a data set or what have you, or get a data set internally and take a tool set, a self-service tool set, and start, going at it. And really, you have dashboards and reports that are huge, consuming a lot of memory and all these kind of things where with the data literacy training and understanding it and maturity, that would be more precise.
Or are there, is there an interesting example where you've had good success in an analytics use case, bringing like non-traditional or third-party data or unstructured data together with kind of standard enterprise data?
Sure. Well, customer churn is one. Our customers are obviously surgeons, so surgeon churn is one area that we've utilized both kinds of data sets, and we continue to mature on that. In terms of predictive analytics around surgeon churn, because that's very important on which products surgeons prefer, and whether it's from us or our competition, right? Because that gives us insight into what we need to focus on as well.
Yeah, interesting. Makes sense. And just for the audience, in the orthopedics industry, surgeon preference is a huge driver of both product development, product roadmap, and sales. So it's it's almost like the holy grail of figuring out, how do I make sure that the interest remains, and how do we influence that? So maybe we could to that end, maybe we could close with your thoughts on the following. Med device it's one of the most complex industries, highly regulated industry, global supply chains, global sourcing. How would you characterize the state of data in the med device industry? And what's your thought on how we might see that change in the next 5 years or so?
I think data is going to become more of a product in the med device space, where surgeons and doctors in general, right, even outside of orthopedics, I would say, are going to use data as a product to improve patient care, help provide better feedback to med devices companies on how they can improve their products. So there's a lot of these kind of opportunities out there to improve patient outcomes that haven't been leveraged, or some are starting to leverage right now.
So do you think, for example, that we might see a frameworks emerge where we could take kind of real world movement data in post-operative settings and kind of feed that back so that you can understand the impact of like physical therapy compliance on the outcomes of an implant surgery, just to like breathe a little life into it? Is that like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And our company has a platform like that called My Mobility that the product development team has put together, and that uses data, movement data, and other things that they could use in the future. So that's absolutely very important, especially now with the wearable technologies that we have, and new things that are coming out, right? So as the technology, in the consumer industry improves and becomes more advanced, we can leverage the data from that for our own, advancement of medical device purposes.
That makes sense. And I think that's a great example of how data drives digital. And exactly your concept. This is something I've thought about and written about, this idea of data as a product, and that being a very important part of our digitization journey and digital and data strategy. Super. Well, thanks so much, Atif, for joining me today. I enjoyed our conversation. It was nice to meet you, and I hope you have a terrific rest of your day.
Likewise. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thank you.